Hey guys, just taking a second to do a sort of impromptu Tangent Tuesday. I was watching some old MMA fights and I got to thinking about some fighters that I thought had more potential than what they lived up to. One of the first one that comes to mind is Carlos Newton, who was an incredible athlete, had fantastic grappling, decent striking. Grappling was definitely what he was known for. He only seemed to lose to like all-time greats. Like his major losses were to like Kazushi Sakuraba, Dan Henderson, Matt Hughes, Anderson Silva. It's one of those things where maybe he was just born in the wrong era, and if those guys were not around, he would have done much better. But it's one of those things where, maybe with a better striking coach, perhaps, more developed striking and a better striking game plan, we would have seen, he did hold the welterweight title in the UFC. He beat Pat Miletich for that, but it was one of those things, and arguably beat Matt Hughes. Their first fight ended when Hughes was holding him aloft against the cage and allegedly lost consciousness while Newton had him in a triangle choke, and he dropped to the ground and knocked out Newton with the slam, and that was the first thing that the ref saw. So he raised Matt Hughes' hand, even though he was sort of out of it at the time. So again, looking at the people who he did beat and potentially beat, just it seems like it would have taken just that much more to sort of like push him over the edge and to have been, one of those world-renowned fighters. Another guy that comes to mind is Andrei Arlovsky. That dude was almost analogous to what Frank Shamrock was to his weight class, just a few years before. First of all, he was a big athletic heavyweight. 240 ripped pounds at heavyweight, right? He had really solid kickboxing, very good takedown defense. He had some submissions in his arsenal. His clinch wrestling was good. His ground grappling was competent. And sort of the knock against him was that he had a weak chin. I don't know if he did. Just about everybody at heavyweight has knockout power. So I would suggest that perhaps his main weakness may have been getting overconfident while he was in the pocket. Because he could throw some hands. He did knock people out. But maybe he lingered there too long with guys he shouldn't have. And maybe by being choosier with his selection of targets and his decision about when to engage, he would have had a more prosperous career. Again, he did hold the UFC heavyweight title, but given all of his various attributes, like initially he left the UFC on like a 3 or 4 fight win streak, went outside of it, did okay outside of it, beat Roy Nelson when he was former IFL champion. He was beating Fedor Emelianenko until he wasn't. But if you watch that fight, it's like a 3-minute fight where he's winning, 2 minutes and 58 seconds of it. And then he decides to go for a flying knee and Fedor knocks him out. But given all of his gifts, again, if maybe he'd had a bit of a cooler head on his shoulders or better game plan going into some of his fights, he would have done much better. Speaking of heavyweights, the big what if. Overeem, Alistair Overeem. That was a guy who, he had a reliable submission. He could take your head off with a guillotine choke. Really good knees, really good kicks. I think overall his kickboxing was a little bit overrated. Because even when he fought in K1 and won, mostly he would clinch guys and go for kicks. Those things were really good. And he just, again, sort of lingered in situations where he shouldn't have and got knocked out. But just, he was massive and he had skills. And for him to not win the UFC heavyweight title was very surprising if you saw how he came in at the time. Another heavyweight, Travis Brown, never won the title. But there was a time, like, he was beating guys that people were saying maybe he shouldn't have. So he, again, big guy, fairly athletic for his size. And he had enough skills that he could sort of rumble with anybody. But, couldn't string together enough wins to get a title shot. That would have been interesting, because he had some close fights with, again, guys that maybe he shouldn't have, and he won fights against guys, he beat Josh Barnett when Barnett was ranked, I think, in the top 5. So he was another guy that maybe should have done better than he did. Brief honorable mention for heavyweight was Cole Conrad, who was the Bellator heavyweight champion, went 9-0 in MMA and just decided to hang it up. He was notable for being a fantastic wrestler, a guy that gave Brock Lesnar trouble in the wrestling room, or I guess on the wrestling mats. And, he was the guy that, if he'd hung around longer, could have gone to the UFC, maybe picked up a title there. And again, Bellator champion ain't nothing. Retiring undefeated ain't nothing. But, it's one of those things where potentially he could have had a much longer, more successful career. Moving back down the card, as far as weight classes go, we got Karo Parisian, who was so talented at judo. At his time, nobody really knew how to deal with that, so he'd be tossing dudes over his head all day. He beat some really solid guys. He was giving George St. Pierre some trouble in, I think it was St. Pierre's UFC debut. He beat Matt Serra, who would go on to hold the welterweight title. And at one point, he was actually set to have a welterweight title match against Matt Hughes, but he got injured. And that injury, unfortunately, led to a substance abuse addiction. And that sort of tanked his career from that point onwards. The thing is, he really had a frame that was better suited for lightweight. If you watch his welterweight fights, he's looking a little soft, compared to guys like, Hughes and St. Pierre and Nick Diaz and all those other guys who were just ripped all to hell and have 6-packs. And Karo doesn't. And he's another guy that, if he'd stuck with a good training program, if they had lightweight in the UFC, because they didn't for a huge chunk of his career, but he was a guy that picked up a lot of early experience, and for a time he was only losing to guys who would go on to be champions. Hello, Benny. Hey, Benny. So, again, super talented, and if he had spent more time at lightweight, and which he did later in his career, but that was long past his prime, and maybe gotten more in the striking department, refined that a little bit. Those are the two things that I think could have helped him out, because doing what it would have taken to get to lightweight would have probably improved one of the big knocks against him, which was his conditioning. So he was sort of akin to, what BJ Penn was for a lot of his career. Super talented, but if you could make it out of the first couple of rounds with him, he's yours. He doesn't have the gas tank to keep going. Tyron Woodley is another name that comes to mind. I remember when he was in Strikeforce, I thought he was going to be the next George St. Pierre, because he was a big, powerful wrestler who could submit you. He had a couple submissions on his record. He could hit hard. Great, this guy's going to be the next GSP. And again, it sounds weird to, sort of downplay somebody who did hold and defend the welterweight title. But I don't think he lived up to the potential that he had, I guess. I remember watching his first match with Stephen Thompson, It's like, dude, have you forgotten that you're a big scary wrestler? Because Thompson at that point in his career really didn't have a ground game, and you could see it. Like, for the minute or two that the fight went to the ground, like, Thompson's got nothing for you down there, dude. Like, keep pushing for the takedown. But I can also sort of understand that Stephen Thompson had kind of an unorthodox striking style, and that might put people off of engaging with him. So, and he did beat him the second time. I'm not going to blame him for having a boring performance against Damian Maia, because I think he fought exactly how he should have, which was, I'm going to defend takedowns and hit him opportunistically. Smart game plan. I don't care about that. But, yeah, with all the potential that he had, again, despite winning the welterweight title, I think he could have done better. I think maybe his first ever loss, but the first one I remember was he lost to Tarek Safadine, because he was just getting kicked in the legs and had no idea how to deal with it. Now, in Woodley's case, I think he came in kind of older, so, maybe his cap wasn't going to be as high as some of those other guys. Now, I'll add Holly Holman there. She had such an amazing game plan and execution versus Ronda Rousey. And then for the rest of her career would pretty much just like spam straight punches. She had really good kicks. If you watch her very early MMA career before she got to the UFC, and of course she got the knockout over Rousey with a kick, but she was, getting wins with kicks on the independent circuit. Yeah, and I just wonder, with such a fantastic performance against Rousey, whether, why she didn't ever reach those heights again. It seemed to me like she sort of got stuck in a certain way of fighting, and it was one that was pretty easy for her opponents to figure out. And again, sort of an honorable mention, Marcelo Garcia, who's like arguably, a lot of people would say, the GOAT of no-gi grappling, greatest of all time. Certainly one of the best pound-for-pound no-gi grapplers of all time. He had one MMA fight, and he got cut. Split open, lost the match due to a cut, which he was more or less winning. And it's one of those things where you see someone who's so great at one aspect of MMA. Like, how could his career have gone if he'd actually dedicated himself to it? Although, from my understanding, he just didn't want to. It was like, this isn't fun for me. I'm not going to do it anymore. Okay, your choice. But the fact that he dipped his toes in made all of us grappling nerds a little bit excited for a while. I guess off the top of my head, that's about it. And this is off the top of my head because it is a Tangent Tuesday. So, anyway, I'm sure you guys have some thoughts and feelings on some of those, and please feel free to add your own, because in the breadth of mixed martial arts, I'm sure that I've left a few guys out. But let me know what you think, and leave it down in the comments, and I'll see you later.